Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. Before we get started, I just wanted to remind you that for updates on the show, be sure to follow me on Twitter at OmerQ _. Again, that's at OMERQ _. And if you like the show, please consider supporting it by subscribing on Apple Podcasts or following the show on Spotify so that you get notified when a new episode is released. Also, be sure to send it to your friends. We don't ask you to give us money, just support the show by helping it grow. Just a few easy clicks, that's all it takes. It doesn't cost you a dime, and you can do it in no time. So please, consider doing that, and let's get to the show. Hello everyone, today we're going to be discussing workers' rights. Joining me today is a graduate student studying global labor and who works for an NGO that deals with labor rights, Jamie Fortin. Jamie, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing good. It's been a long day, but we're here, so.
We're here, and we're going to start off by talking about something you're very familiar with. We're going to be talking about Disney. Disney has been in the news lately. They were in the news for laying off over 28,000 workers throughout their subsidiaries. That's companies ranging from Fox to Disney Parks to ESPN even. And of those 28,000, there's also 8,800 union workers who were laid off. So, Jamie, why don't you tell us a little bit about what's going on with Disney and how that affects workers' rights overall?
Yeah, so first of all, I used to work at Disneyland. I worked in Disney Parks. The park in California. I worked there for a little bit over a year. I was in a unionized environment, so I was in one of the biggest, unions in the country, operates at Disneyland. And it's a great place to work overall, but I think we see very distinctly how easily companies will take for granted the really, really quality workers they have. I mean, people love working at Disney, right? It's a place people go because they really like the company, they like the environment. And so I think, thinking about, I'm still in all the labor groups because I'm just curious, on Facebook, I'm still in all the Facebook groups. And I think, looking at how that kind of had an impact on all the people there, first of all, it is heartbreaking. I mean, they told Disney cast members 15 minutes before they told the general public that they would be laying off 28,000 workers, primarily from the parks and resorts. Yes, 15 minutes advance notice that they would be doing massive layoffs. They're trying not to lay off full-time workers, but a lot of these people are, like you said, unionized. Those people had it the worst, I would say, as far as notice, because they were told and then they had to sit there and wait for their unions to have negotiations. And so all weekend, people described it like that, like the Marvel movie, where all the people disappear. It's like every day at the end of the day, you like see people get dusted and you're like, oh my God, like who's next, And I think overall, we're going to see a resurgence in labor unions hopefully in the next few years. Because of this, when all this started happening, the first thing we saw was, if I had to guess, I'd say 80 to 90% of non-union workers at Disney parks were gone day one. I mean, they just completely got rid of them, right? Because they can. And so they incentivize people to not unionize by paying them like few quarters more, right? An hour, as if that actually matters, right? And then now that they're not unionized, they can just get rid of them out of hand and, have no consequences for it. So I think when we see things like this happen, we're going to see a really big resurgence in the labor movement, or at least I hope we are, where people are realizing like, okay, labor unions aren't this big bad wolf coming after corporations and small businesses. Like, they are actually very necessary protectors. There's a law in California specifically that's really important that says nobody can be hired for the next 365 days after a mass layoff starts. That hasn't already been. And I guess for the first year, because they need to call back other people first who were already laid off. So no new people can be hired for that first year. And these are the types of laws that labor unions fought for to make sure that people have these protections. The higher we see unemployment rates go, the more we're going to see people needing to be protected. And I think it's extremely evident right now. People are taking for granted our super low unemployment rates. People are taking for granted their employees in general, because, they're increasing wages in a lot of ways. I think Disney increased to $15 an hour for like a bunch of their Disneyland parks cast members, and everybody was like, oh wow, we really are like happy with this. they're taking for granted all of these people. So I think, with all these massive layoffs, a few airlines have had the same thing. Yeah. And for union busting measures, they increase the amount of part-time workers that people hire at different companies so that people are less likely to form unions, in places like Disneyland, grocery stores. You have really, really high turnover rates. So you're less likely to form a union if you're not going to be there for that long. So hopefully we see an increase in the amount of people working full-time as well to strengthen those labor laws.
So do you know if Disney received any funding from the COVID relief package or the CARES Act?
I actually don't know. That's a really good question.
Right. I know that United is a company that received money from that, and they received PPP money, and then they went off and they cut a lot of their workforce. They cut a lot of pilots. They cut a lot of airline hostesses and stewards. And I know a bunch who got laid off. And I think this speaks to not just the issue of unions and union rights and workers' rights. It also speaks to this idea of like these large corporations who have essentially monopolized certain industries, like Disney. Is there are competitors. There's Universal. There's a few others, Six Flags if you want to put them in there. But there's only one Disney. Disney's a conglomerate. It's not just parks. It's entertainment. It's ESPN. It's ABC. It's Fox News now. It's all these different companies under one roof, under one conglomerate. And I think the issue that you run into, and a lot of people like to say that, regulation is going to lead to the downfall of capitalism. Regulation is what leads to, lack of innovation or, no innovation. But when you really think about it, what leads to a lack of innovation is when one company owns or has a monopoly over an entire industry. Like, look, for example, the WWE, which is something that our friend Andrew Yang has been talking about a lot. They're a wrestling company, and they have a huge monopoly on wrestling, and none of their workers, none of their wrestlers are employees. They're independent contractors. That's their status.
Right.
But at the same time, because there's no real competition, but you are seeing some competition rise up recently, but for almost 20 years, there was no competition. And in those 20 years, WWE controlled the way that they were going to be booked as far as their private bookings. They were controlling the way that their public appearances. They're controlling other ways that they were making money. There's this whole controversy of the independent contractors that are in that company. They're not allowed to have Twitch accounts, and if they do, most of the money has to be shared with the WWE. And you can say that about a lot of companies that do business like that. And I think, you actually spoke to it. This is why we need unions. This is why we need to have, strong workers' rights and, have workers at the table in a lot of these scenarios. Because if you don't have representation of the workers, then you're not going to be able to run a company that benefits them in the best way.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, one of the things that I just remembered this, I don't know how I forgot about it, but one of the things that is most frustrating for a lot of cast members right now is workers are being used as pawns to try to get California to open up and allow the theme parks to open. So they actually, when they released the statement, which was pretty much, usually it's the exact same statement to cast members that they released, 15, 20 minutes later to the public, they said, because of these reasons, and by the way, Newsom should open parks, we are going to lay off a bunch of our cast members. And, I think that's just very telling. They could keep these cast members. They really could. The top making people in Disney, they make so much money. It's ungodly. The brand new CEO is, this is so unsurprising. The brand new CEO is known to be somebody, Bob Chapek is known to be somebody who's going to cut a lot of corners, is really going to bare bones the company, which is just totally against the mission of Disney, right? It's supposed to be super extra. Like, that's why people like Disneyland, right? It's supposed to be the most extra shit you've ever seen. And, we knew he was going to bare bones the company. We knew he was going to cut off from the bottom. And some companies, Whole Foods, when they first started, and I believe in 2014, I was just telling you about the book I'm reading written by the Whole Foods CEO. He actually in 2014, so I don't know how it is now, especially now that they're bought out by Amazon, said that the highest paid person, including all of their, bonuses and promotional money, can't make more than 19 times the median worker at the company.
Really?
19. The average, it goes between 300 and 500 usually times the median worker. It's insane. There's no reason for that. And Dan Price is the CEO of a really cool financial company, and he took $1 million pay cut a year so he could pay his lowest paid workers $70,000 a year. Like, they're providing more for his company than other workers are. And so I don't know, I think you can really see the true colors of a company when things go down like this. I think it's very clear.
Right.
And Disney is showing its true colors. Hopefully, cast members are seeing it, and there's some of the biggest spenders at Disney. So hopefully, the general public's going to see it too and not be disillusioned by the pixie dust, as they say.
Right. The other thing that I think plays a hand in this is, the corporate influence in politics and, how Washington and even, state government affects these industries. I feel like there's enough support in the public that Disney should have a union. Places like Amazon should have unions, strong unions, places that protect the workers, that make the lives of the workers better, that make the experience of the consumers who are actually using their products and their services better. I think that's agreed upon. If anyone who's like a working class American, I think agrees with that. But the sad part is our government doesn't necessarily show that. They don't really show that in the way that they do business. They don't show that in the way that they conduct themselves with these companies. They kind of pony up and, they like play friends with these big conglomerates when they should be really dealing with the problems that affect the workers under these companies. Like, I don't know if Disney does this. Do you know if Disney does a lot of corporate lobbying? I imagine they do.
Well, so corporate lobbying for Disney, what I would say is most of their lobbying is probably through other agents. So there's lots of PACs, lots of industry associations. I worked for one major U.S. apparel industry association, and essentially all these apparel companies, including Disney, pay dues to the industry association. And they get lots of benefits from that. Some of them actually very positive for the world and are doing really, really good things in apparel supply chains. Some of them just lobby money. So, I mean, Disney is for sure, throwing money at these 501c4s. I think you've talked about it in other podcasts. Yeah. They're like quote unquote nonprofits. They're not technically like for profit, but they're not for profit is what they call them. They're not for profit.
They're officially designated as political nonprofits. And then I just want to start off by saying there's a lot of C4s that do good work. The issue that I've always had is the dark money. Because when you don't know where money's coming from, when there's money going to political causes, you don't know where it's coming from. Like the FEC, for example. We know exactly who's donating to what campaign. If you donate above a certain amount, you have to list your employer, you have to list legally your name and your address and all that information. So we know exactly who the money's coming from. So we know, one, it's an American. Two, it's someone who is going to, it's not someone like a foreign entity trying to involve themselves in our affairs.
Right.
The problem with C4s is they hide all that information. We don't really see where any of that goes. And behind the scenes, what are a lot of these C4s doing? Some good work, but through that, a lot of these C4s, they open the door for a lot of corporate influence. And, you and I have both seen it ourselves in DC, working in DC. When these corporate lobbyists or these, corporations or these CEOs, they donate tens of thousands of dollars to political causes. Why is it? One, it's to help their influence, and two, it literally buys them a seat at the table. I've been to forums where they're literally at the table sitting with congressmen and senators and congresswomen. It's maddening when you think about it, because you have these, all of these members of Congress who are wasting their time talking to these corporate CEOs who are essentially, like I said, buying seats at the table. And they could have used all of that time they're spending, doing donor calls or, all those kinds of stuff for, having lunch with the CEO of Amazon. I don't know who Jeff Bezos has lunch with, but I imagine it's somebody important, right?
Someone for sure.
I'm sure, right? But they do that instead of, working on bills. Like, we're almost, I think, 8 months into a pandemic now, and there's been one stimulus check sent out. There's been one stimulus package passed in Congress. That is a shame. Or passed, into law. That is a shame. And in the meantime, Zoom calls are still happening. These corporate CEOs are still doing Zoom calls. They're still doing, meet and greets with a lot of these people who are these congressmen and women who are campaigning for re-election right now and who really need the money. And That's been my biggest problem is I never liked these political organizations opening the door for corporate influence into politics, because corporate
Right.
influence is what leads to issues like workers' rights, issues like the environment, issues like discrimination of anybody in society to decide. That's how they get to decide, and that's how we end up talking about how we need to give corporations bailouts, how we need to bail out Amazon, bail out United, even though they're giving their CEOs and their executives raises while they're laying off thousands of workers. It's never sat well with me, and that's why I've always said, okay, you can be a political nonprofit. All political nonprofits do good, but you can do it in a way that doesn't corrupt our already foundly corrupt political system.
Yeah, and I mean, how much of a detriment is this to small and medium enterprises? I mean,
Oh
it
yeah.
is insane. I went to these meetings. There is a weekly meeting. I'll try not to say names so I don't get myself in trouble, but I used to go to weekly meetings, and essentially in attendance was a bunch of, essentially it was hosted by one major organization, industry association, where a bunch of other industry associations in adjacent industries could all show up every Friday. It's like a little club, all old white men. Not complaining. This is the truth. All, I'm the youngest person by probably 30 to 50 years, and it's all a bunch of men there.
Right.
And every week, they have a new person, maybe from the government or whatever, and all of these people have these high level seats at the table. And I got to thinking, I'm like, okay, if I wasn't so lucky to have this job and have a boss who is kind enough to let me come to these things as a very low paid intern, I would never have a seat at the table. Small and medium businesses, they don't get that seat at the table. Like, if you want to talk about encouraging entrepreneurship and encouraging innovation, like letting all of these big companies make the decisions while the small and medium enterprises are completely, I mean, there's like one or two industry associations maybe for small and medium enterprises, and they do some work and they do good lobbying and whatever. But it's not a business environment that is conducive to entrepreneurship. It's just not.
Right.
It creates, a boys club kind of situation, and it doesn't help. It doesn't help anybody. And actually, Andrew Yang also talks about this, where right now we are at a record low for innovation and new business startups, especially for women. So
during a time where there's almost no regulation against corporate enterprise and corporate business under Trump.
Right. Yeah. Well, and even if you think about a year ago, like let's say we're before COVID, right? And, all's going well with the economy. The economy's booming. The GDP is really high. Workers are making shit money, especially in comparison to the highest earners. Like, the relative income of the lowest paid worker is by far and away way lower than it has been relative to the highest paid earners. And then we have a business environment that's just not great, and it's declining every year. If our economy is booming, that should mean we have more innovation. That should mean we have less poor people like on the streets. It's not, these things don't line up, and it's because we have this system where the highest earners keep earning money passively and actively, and the lowest paid earners are the ones paying those people.
So I think the question becomes, like, how do you fix that? How do you address that? Because I think the knock that a lot of people have with, progressives, that we are good at identifying problems, but we're not good at pointing out solutions. When I think it's just inaccurate, because the solutions are quite simple. We're talking about,
but you're not going to fund them though,
Exactly. You want to fund, corporate bailouts or Wall Street bailouts, but you don't want to fund easy solutions to problems you want to make more complex so people get confused about them and forget about them, right? And like just take something like dark money in elections or corporate money in elections. There's a very easy fix. But you have people like Andrew Yang and Bernie Sanders come out and say that we need public funded elections. It's not, out of the realm of possibility to do that. Other countries have that. And and Andrew Yang actually had a very good system. I think he called it democracy dollars. He marketed stuff in a very good way.
He's so good at marketing.
Even his freedom dividend was an amazing marketing technique. I honestly think progressives need to work. If we need to work on one thing, it's marketing, because
we need more business owners as progressives.
Honestly, we kind of need that, marketing entrepreneurial spirit, because I think a lot of times we do things out of anger and, just justifiable anger. And, we kind of market it in like that way. And we just say, oh, just do it. Just do it. Just do it.
But anger is not necessarily productive.
Exactly. Yeah. Andrew Yang, he said that in order to publicly fund elections, just give everyone democracy dollars. Each individual citizen has $100 to give, and they can give, as much as they want to any candidate within that $100 range. And I thought that was a good system because it includes people who don't have disposable income to give
right.
to those campaigns, because there's a lot of people who are left out of political process or who feel like, oh, I want to give to, this grassroots candidate who doesn't seem like they have a chance, right? Because the other candidate is a corporate funded machine politician. And I think the $100 or even like something like the freedom dividend, that gives people that disposable income in their hands to kind of take back power from these corporations. It's really powerful, and it's a really easy solution to a problem that's also pretty easy to identify.
I mean, yeah, there are lots of solutions. They're all out there. It's one of my favorite people, obviously AOC, said it's funny when we
shout out to the queen.
Shout out to the queen, AOC. You can hate her policies, but damn, is she a good public servant? Like, she's just good at that. Like, that is the model.
She's one of the only public servants left in politics.
One of the only people who says, I am doing this to serve the people. Anyway, I could obviously go on forever about AOC. But one of the things she likes to say is, it's funny to me how our pockets seem empty when it's the morally right thing to do.
Right.
Like, and that's always what it comes down to, right? I was talking to someone recently. He's like, oh, you want to tax all the billionaires? Well, you're going to run out of all that money, and then you're just going to have all these people taking handouts and blah, blah, blah. The reason we don't have innovation is because people don't have money to spend. Like, one of my biggest pet peeves in the business world is we have all of these founders have these like stories of like, oh, I started in my garage, and, in the book by John Mackey, Conscious Capitalism, he talks about like, oh, I showered in the original Whole Foods location. Like, how much privilege do you have to be able to choose to be poor? Like, oh, I'm choosing to be poor. I got 48 grand from my friends and family. Like, my friends and family barely have, the average American doesn't even have $500 in savings for an emergency. Like, most people don't have, like, I can knock door to door for my friends and family and borrow like $48K. Like, that's not the reality for people. Like, we would have, if we bring up the base from the bottom, like, we have these solutions in front of us. They're all here. We can make people more wealthy. I believe it's about 60% of medical innovations come from people at home who just need the medical innovation.
Right.
And our version of capitalism right now says, if it's not going to impact enough people to where that particular product is super, super big and whatever affects enough people, then we're just not going to do it. So all this medical innovation is coming just out of necessity or because people can't,
So I actually had Ben Bernbach, who's a friend and a former colleague, and he's also a libertarian, on the show a few weeks ago. And one of the things we were talking about was, like, my biggest problem with the conventional American capitalism and its approach is I would be fine with it if everyone from the point of origin had the same and equal opportunity as everyone else. The problem is, with our country's history, a lot of white, rich, male landowners controlled a lot of the influence and power in this country for hundreds of years. We had African Americans who, up until like 2 generations ago, were still slaves, were still property. And, that's a problem that's an economic, social, and political problem that we've yet to deal with to the fullest extent. And I said, if we get to a point where that equality of opportunity is actually equal for everyone, we get to an even playing field, then I think that the approach of American capitalism, what a lot of people argue, I think it can work. And we kind of got into this weird thing where we were agreeing, him being a libertarian, me being more of a leftist, we were agreeing on, okay, if we can get to a point where these social welfare programs eventually over time lead to an equality of opportunity, then I think, that conventional capitalistic approach can work in our society. The problem is we're just so far away from it that I don't think that that's the right approach to take. And a lot of people who argue for, fiscal responsibility and things like that, and as, arguments against these programs, I think they're either completely ignorant of the fact that we don't have that equality of opportunity, or they're deliberately ignoring it. Again, this is another thing. A lot of, if you talk to everyday people and if you actually engage with them, they tend to agree with it, I think. And, they kind of they at least understand. I think as a country especially, we need to kind of have these conversations more. We need to be able to engage our own views and take someone else's views and kind of come to some sort of understanding and see how they can mesh together. Obviously, I'm someone who thinks there's certain things that I don't want to move on. There's a lot of issues out there that can be addressed through real understanding and common sense solutions. The problem is a lot of people in charge, they don't really work like that. They try to trap us into this faux bipartisanship that really it's not helping many people. It's not helping a lot of the working class. It's pretty much just helping suburban and white America.
Yeah, I would say I like to tell people I don't think there's as big of an issue with Republican versus Democrat as like the top percent of earners versus the bottom percent of earners. And there's always, on the left, I'm sure you've heard a lot of times, there's this like big question, like why do, middle class white people always vote against their own interests and vote for the right? And it's because, half the stuff we're debating, I have a friend named Riley. He and I debate things all the time, and we have the same goals, right? Like we both want economic prosperity for our country. Like we both want equality of opportunity, but we have both seen, the things he tells me of reasons why these social programs, a universal basic income won't work, are all of this rhetoric we get from one side or the other, which is just so unhelpful. But Democrats and Republicans both very good at being businesses. One of the podcasts I listened to called Freakonomics talked about the hidden duopoly, and essentially it's like, Republicans and Democrats are this like, fighting each other helps them survive.
Yeah, it does. It does. I actually had this it's interesting. I was talking to one of my old campaign buddies about this, and we were talking about how the Democratic Party has kind of benefited from how extreme Trump is in his rhetoric and his policies, because he's fundraised a lot more money than the Democrats probably would have had otherwise if, they had a more moderate candidate. Because Trump is a great campaign tool. He's a great fundraising tool for Democrats. Fundraised a lot more money, like I said, than it would have. And, it kind of is a cycle, because you can make the argument that a lot of mainstream corporate Democrats would even be fine with Trump being in office for another 4 years, because the way that DC works, folks, I'm just going to lay it out very simple. So corporations give money to political campaigns and super PACs, right? Then those super PACs and those political operatives or those members of Congress, what they do is they hold the special interests of the corporations in more power than, the constituents they're supposed to serve, right? So they're really like tied to that special interest. And with Trump, it's like this thing where these corporations, they're also benefiting from Trump's policies. Like CEOs especially had permanent tax cuts under Trump's tax cuts. That's one thing that oddly you don't see a lot of Democrats going after Trump's tax cuts for. They don't go after the fact that the tax cuts end for working class Americans in about 5 years, but it's permanent for all corporate business, right? But corporations that are benefiting from Trump's policies get to give money to Democratic campaigns, and they essentially one, buy a seat at the table to protect their other interests, and two, they get to tell their friends in their wine parties or their wine caves or whatever, they're part of the resistance. They're part of resisting against Trump. And it just goes in a cycle. Like,
right.
President's policies are helping them, but they're giving money to fight the president. But at the same time, it's not like the Democrats or the corporate Democratic establishment is really doing much to fight him in reality or fight his policies.
Right. Well, and, one of the most radical things that AOC did that pissed off Democrats and Republicans was say no to Amazon.
Right.
That made everyone furious. And they're like, oh, she's trying to block all these jobs from coming to New York. But first of all, gentrification is not a job creator. Okay, contrary to popular belief, it doesn't help the working poor. It drives them out and drives in these other big businesses. So that's one of the big problems with that argument. And another is that Amazon started a bidding war for your taxes, to say, oh, who's going to give me the biggest tax breaks? And AOC was like, I'm not using my people's money to fund Amazon. Like, that's not my jam. That's not what I'm here to do. Like, I'm not here to serve these corporate interests and give you giant tax breaks. And Disney has the same issue all the time. Disney, every time that Disneyland California sets off fireworks, and I don't know if this is just conjecture that like is how the rumor mills go, or if this is like a huge deal actually, but Disney pays money every single time they set off fireworks shows and do it anyway, because they're getting fined by the government. Like they were actually supposed to build, I believe, a new hotel and get into huge fights with the Anaheim government all the time because they don't get enough tax breaks on these like giant things they're building, because in reality, they're not creating any value for the people. And I mean, Democrats and Republicans both really, really like serving those corporate interests. They're okay with taking the tax breaks because it's not really their taxes, right? They're getting the same paycheck either way. I mean,
right.
that's just the cyclical nature of it. That's just how they go. Right. We're in a fight with I think if politics were a little bit more just, we'd have more Bernie Sanders, we'd have more AOC, we'd have more of these politicians that actually
we'd have more Justin Amash
for the people.
Yeah, and Justin Amash is a libertarian who I emphatically disagree with on a lot of fundamental views, but the one thing I do agree with him on, and with politicians who are more anti-establishment, is the fact that they're willing to go against this corporate duopoly, the fact that they're willing to call it out, the fact that they're actually willing to go out there and vote in a manner that represents that viewpoint. Because it's one thing, there's a lot of rhetoric, there's a lot of pandering from, whether it's, you want to call it the Republican establishment or even the Democratic establishment. They'll pander to a lot of issues, but at the end of the day, they really won't change much. That's obviously changed a little bit under Trump. He has a lot of foreign policy, especially, that's changing a lot of how we do business internationally. But speaking domestically specifically, not much has changed as far as the power structure, the political structure. It's relatively remained the same. And I think, just kind of going off, that's kind of what's led to this downfall for Trump, because he's doing a lot of crazy stuff right now, right? But, I think what's really led to his downfall is he ran in 2016 as an outsider, as someone who's going to come and clean up the swamp, as someone who has a vision for America. And the issue is his vision, his cleaning of the swamp, never happened. So he's running on a vision that, one, didn't work. And he's also trying to run as the establishment's pick, as the establishment's nominee, when his entire message in 2016 was anti-establishment. That's why you got a lot of working class voters, specifically in the Midwest, coming over to Trump, because they saw him as someone who's different. Because the Obama era, the Bush era were not nice to them. They were not kind to those workers, so they felt they needed something different. And that's something you don't hear a lot, and I wish that people would talk about it more, because it's going to play a crucial role in this election, and it's playing a crucial role as to why Biden is up, because Trump has really alienated that base by not offering much.
Well, and that's super interesting you bring that up too, because on the corporate front and on the labor front, Trump is not helping anybody. I mean, he really isn't. On the corporate front, I mean, the lobbyist I worked at was pissed at Trump because he was, if you remember the trade war with China, I don't know if you remember that little blimp in history. I mean, about a year ago, he increased import taxes by about 50% for footwear, let's say, specifically footwear. I mean, these companies make their purchases about a year in advance. So that's a year of 50% of the cost of that shoe for an entire year is just going to be placed on American businesses. That's lost American jobs. That's lost American manufacturing, farmers, total shit show, because farmers do a lot of their selling to China, specifically in the Midwest. He wasn't helping corporate interests at all in that kind of department with the international affairs. Like, people were pissed. He wasn't being helpful for any of those interests. And then with labor, I mean, Trump is historically anti-labor. I have a friend who was telling me that the reason he liked Trump was because his international affairs, which, like I've said, is a shit show, and because and then this guy's like a union worker, right? He's a union electrician. And I told him, I hope you don't like your union, because Trump has never been there for the worker. And I understand his rhetoric was really appealing towards people who felt unheard by the left. And I think the left really does need to recapture that kind of part of the base, because most union workers have historically been Democrats, and they're slowly moving over to the right. And I think that's the Democrats' fault. I think we did that as the left.
Right.
But Trump, hopefully when we see this labor resurgence and realize that our unemployment numbers are skyrocketing, they're not going down anytime soon, and when people are starting to hopefully kind of really look into that and say, like, okay, how do we improve job markets? Mm-hmm. Trump is never the answer. He never has been. We weren't looking at it before because we didn't really have to worry about it, because we were in a recovery. We were in an improving business cycle. But now that people are forced to look at it, I'm really hoping with this resurgence of labor unions, they're trying to unionize Amazon, and a couple of unions have really been looking into that, trying to unionize Whole Foods. And with these, skyrocketing unemployment rates, I'm really hoping people start saying, look, like, Trump has never wanted the best for the worker. He just hasn't. And he doesn't hide that at all either. He's never been somebody who's like, oh, I say I'm for the worker, but, he's full of shit. Like, that's any businessman. You don't want a businessman running a country, because businessmen work for themselves and politicians are supposed to work for the people. That's the bottom line. Why would you want a businessman who's trying to cut costs, specifically on the labor side, which we've seen with Disney and Delta, etc.? Why would you want that person being the one in charge of your stimulus check, which, by the way,
has not
Trump
come.
has already agreed to delaying it. Well, he just announced a couple of days ago that he will not be approving any stimulus bill until after the election. Mm-hmm. He just said that he would do that right now. So why would you want that person to be your president?
Like,
why would you want that person to represent you?
Someone like that, they're good on like a House committee on business or a House committee on economics, because they provide a perspective. Businesses, I still believe, provide a very important perspective in the overall economy, but they're not the end all be all. That shouldn't be what you're running on. That shouldn't be the reason you elect an individual, just because they're a businessman, because they understand the way that a corporation works. Because at the end of the day, a president is more than just the executive in charge of running, charge of money. It's in charge of foreign policy. It's in charge of the military. It's in charge of all of these domestic issues like the $15 minimum wage or the environmental policy or anything else that we're pushing for, right? So, and that's the problem. You see Trump, look at the areas he's weak on. Polling suggests that Trump is overall better than Biden on the economy. That's changed in the last week since the debate for obvious reasons. But, generally, even throughout COVID, most people said that they trust Trump more than they trust Biden on the economy. And that's an area he's strong in, but in almost every single other area, he's struggling. He's struggling with women. He's struggling with minorities, LGBTQ rights. He's struggling with issues like climate change. He's struggling with issues like workers' rights. There's so many areas that Trump is just he's not even competing with Biden in as far as polling goes. And I think that's what really has hurt him. And I think America, or at least our generation, has kind of learned a lesson this time around about electing businessmen or business people into that high of public office. Because, again, while they provide an important perspective, we can't rely on them to look out for the best interests of the person who's suffering the most in this country, because they're always going to be looking out for the main thing, and that's the bottom dollar. And that's not how you can't run. That's why I always say you can't run a country like a business, because a country is supposed to work for the betterment of its citizens and for the people, but a business works for the betterment of itself.
Right. Well, and if you think about someone like Trump, right, we have a system, and for a long time, our economy has run like this, both in business and in politics. We measure the economy based on gross domestic product, GDP, and based on, the stock market and how that's performing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's great for Trump. Most of his money is, his trust and all that jazz. And measuring the economy based on GDP is great for someone like Trump and great for all of the big money on Wall Street, right? It's great for them. But the reason, like you said, that politics shouldn't be run like a business is because GDP doesn't mean jack to the average American. GDP doesn't measure how many jobs we have. GDP doesn't measure a business climate. GDP doesn't measure any of that. And I think we're starting to learn that as, I think there's this kind of disillusionment that Trump is trying to create that people just really aren't buying right now, which is he's saying, we're having this great recovery. And every single day, 28,000 jobs lost at Disney, this many thousands of jobs lost in the airline industry. And people are like, oh, fuck, this doesn't add up. The economy is soaring, right? Which, some people predict there's going to be a bubble popping in December. I don't know how likely that is, but I wouldn't be surprised. But there's all these numbers, economies are soaring, businesses are doing great as they're laying off thousands of workers and then giving huge bonuses to CEOs. Businesses apparently booming, right? But the average American isn't getting anything,
right? And that's
and
why these tools like the stock market, like GDP, showing how big business revenues are, they're not good indicators of the overall economy. A lot of more right-leaning people like to refer to these metrics, but they don't refer to metrics like average income. They don't refer to
right.
Things like the amount of jobs people work. They talk about, the economy has added 10,000 jobs this month, but they don't factor in things like how many of those people were already working a first job, how many of those people have children who they're providing for. It's these metrics that, to an extent, yes, they're immeasurable, but also we don't really go out of our way to really figure out new metrics. And that's the thing, about Biden. It's good that he's brought in someone like Andrew Yang, who has actually thought out these ideas. And I've harped on him for a while on this podcast, but it's important because he's really changed the way that I think a lot of people view the economy and are viewing how our politics works. It's weird. He's one of those fringe candidates in this election. You had a few of them. You had John Delaney. You had Steve Bullock. Those kind of people you didn't think would go anywhere. But then as the campaign went along, you saw Andrew Yang kind of shifted the national conversation. UBI, Universal Basic Income, has now become a mainstream staple in the political conversation. Every day you hear about it. Every day you see someone retweeting about it. Every day you hear news articles about it, or you read news articles about it. So, the way he shifted the conversation, I think it's good because it's showing that, someone like Biden, who is more moderate, who's more in line with the mainstream corporate wing of the Democratic Party, he's brought in somebody who is kind of an anomaly in this political world that we live in right now. He's one of the only voices backing those ideas. He's the only time I've ever heard about things like UBIs from Andrew Yang. I'd never heard about it before, and I think a lot of Americans right now did not hear about it before Andrew Yang either. So I think it's good that he's brought that in, because with that comes, a lot of workers and working class people who liked Andrew Yang and liked his policies. And
yeah,
I think,
and as much as I don't really like Biden, I'm just so grateful that Yang is doing the campaign to show people, look, yeah. And I think you were telling me, right, that you had someone who was super pro Trump, and you're like, dude, you loved Yang, and Yang is joining Biden's campaign, but to show someone I obviously was Yang gang all the way. I was an Andrew Yang voter. I voted for him in the primary election out of spite, even though, and I think Yang didn't run to become president. He knew he didn't have a shot. Yang ran to amplify a very important platform to him. And I think that is a super interesting way to look at presidential elections and at candidates. Why are all these people running? They know they're not going to win. Well, they all have their reasons, right? Usually it's not always to win. A lot of times it is to bring an issue to the national stage that should really be in politics. But I think something that he did that was really important, that a lot of Democrats have done, is try to rally their base around, this major candidate. When at the end of the day, like Yang is saying, look, dude, like it's very clear I don't agree with a lot of things that Biden is saying, right? I just don't. I don't agree with a lot of it. And I don't think that's any secret. But who's going to be the most effective in getting towards those goals we have? Well, like that's going to be Biden,
Right.
It's going to be him. And he's like really, I think, helped a lot of that. I think Yang came out of Trump, people who were like, I don't really like sexist polls very much. But I also don't really think the Democratic Party is working for me. Like that is kind of the intersection that Yang captured a lot. I have an economics degree from a very conservative college in the South. I know these people very well, who are like, oh, I just can't vibe with the Dems, they're too. And Yang spoke to them and was like, okay, like, look, I agree with you. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a businessman. Let's give you a dividend. Like, let's, he really spoke to that generation. I just hope people realize, it seems like a more right-wing thing to believe, his very like pro-business stances, but Biden at the end of the day is going to be the best way to go for all those things.
Right. So let's shift gears and talk a little bit about the Supreme Court. As you may have heard, Amy Coney Barrett has been nominated by President Donald Trump as his pick to replace Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who passed away earlier this month. What is your views on Amy Coney Barrett? She is more conservative, obviously. This is an effort for the Republicans to shift the court in a 6-3 favor for conservative justices for years to come. So what's your reaction to everything that's gone on over the last month?
Part of me is like, you're supposed to like her. She's a woman. We want more women in power. And then, identity politics are kind of trash anyway. But a lot of people are really nervous about her, especially on the progressive side, because of her affiliation with very, conservative religious groups, which is fair. And she hasn't. I know her 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 judicial record isn't really as concerning, I think, as people think it is. So that's a little bit more heartening. But I think with the Supreme Court, what we see in the Supreme Court, and I think this is like a very big reason we have a need for feminism in politics and in corporations, but specifically in politics, what we see is right now during this time where rights for women and rights for minorities and rights for LGBTQ are so kind of fresh right now, especially for the LGBTQ community in the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
We kind of, especially as progressives, I think sometimes we'll look at politics and decision making and laws as this like progress type, progressives. We want progress. But in reality, things go backwards all the time.
Yeah.
It's very common, and the Supreme Court can do that very easily with abortion rights. It's been teetering for years, depending on the state. These things are very volatile. So I think, in most cases, I really think a balance of having like more conservative, more progressive voices is usually a pretty good thing, in the House and the Senate, etc. Like I think having that balance is really important to make sure people are heard. But it concerns me with a 6-3, conservative majority. I'm 24, I'm female, and, I want access to affordable healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
I worked at Disneyland. So fun fact for most people who don't know, like there's a really, really big LGBT community in Disneyland. So I'd say 40% of the people I love most are in that community, and they're terrified. I mean, this is really, if you talk about, things that are going to be impacting people the most right now, these are rights that can be very easily stripped from us. The rights for women and rights for, LGBT community. And I think that's like the most concerning thing with the Supreme Court justice nomination is like, okay, you might be conservative and really vibe with, conservative majority, but overnight you can strip us of those rights.
Yeah, that's the thing that's concerning a lot of people, I think, in this country who are, members of a lot of different communities, because, things like even racial discrimination and disenfranchisement in elections, as well as, women's rights to their own bodies, as well as LGBTQ rights. All of these things are kind of, they're dependent on the Supreme Court and their rulings protecting them, right? And that's why it's very concerning when you have, like, look at even the Amy Coney Barrett situation and with her nomination. Senator Josh Hawley, who is a Republican, a very rising star in the Republican Party right now, when he was asked about the judicial process, going forward with it, he said he would only move forward with it if they would guarantee that there would be a judge that would overturn Roe v. Wade. Like, that would have to be a prerequisite. This is a sitting U.S. senator who openly said this to a reporter before she was even nominated. This is just coming days after the passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So, when you hear stuff like that, it's extremely problematic and worrying. And when you see things like the Supreme Court with Justices Alito and Justice Clarence Thomas coming out and already discussing, readdressing the Obergefell case that protects same-sex marriage, like, these things are happening very fast, and they're happening faster than we can really keep track of. A lot of people don't even know that some of this stuff is happening because there's so much distraction and so much complexity in the news. It's just important to note that this stuff doesn't just affect, just because it doesn't affect you doesn't mean it doesn't affect somebody that you know or somebody that you love. Because we can thing is, we can disagree about the politics of things. We can disagree about, morals even. But one thing we can't disagree on is protecting the rights, the individual liberties of our fellow Americans. And while those individual liberties, at some point you might not agree with them in the practice of your own life, you can't say that the other person does not have the right to practice their individual liberty, to practice their rights as American, to vote, to the rights of their own bodies, to the rights to marry and love who they want. It's like, these are things that affect everybody. So I think it's important that even if you're not directly affected by some of these issues, you take notice of the system and how all of these things are set into motion, and know that it's not coming from a place that is 100% genuine, 100% working towards the betterment of American society. It's coming from a place of let's just call for what it is, pure corruption. Because these are decisions, these are dealings that are made behind closed doors. Amy Coney Barrett is the pick of Republican donors like the Koch brothers. That's why there's such a big push. That's why Mitch McConnell is pushing so hard for this nomination. It's because a lot of Republican donors want to get this through now. They see their chance to get a 6-3 court. They see an election coming that is going to be contested under any circumstances. Trump, I genuinely believe Trump could lose with Biden getting 400 electoral college votes, and he would still contest this election. And the Supreme Court plays a role in that, because while you might have a justice like Chief Justice Roberts probably side with the liberals, as he's known to do in some cases, if Amy Coney Barrett is on there, I don't think you're going to see her go against the person who just nominated her and got her through within less than a month of her nomination.
Yeah, no. I totally agree with you. And I think, if there's any time to be concerned about how politics is affecting your life day to day, like, at the end of the day, like, a new president or impacting the economy, like, we're really not going to see that very much overall in our day-to-day life. We're not going to see the impact that, the China trade war has on the American economy. We might see our Nikes go up a couple cents, but overall, like, the American public isn't really going to see that impact. But millions of Americans are going to see the impact of a super, super conservative, Supreme Court. And that's, I think, like, so concerning, just so concerning. With the Affordable Care Act as well. Repealing the Affordable Care Act, I think a lot of Americans right now are taking for granted how important that was to millions of Americans. My best friend recently had a stroke. She's 24 years old, perfectly healthy, had a stroke. Wow. And she's terrified with the repeal of the Affordable Care Act because she might not have health care anymore because she has a pre-existing condition now. That is, like I said, as a woman who doesn't want to get pregnant soon, they don't have to give me, reproductive health care. I don't have to have affordable reproductive health care. Planned Parenthood, which is always, on the chopping block, they provide, cancer screenings for millions of women for free and reduced prices because people just can't afford it. Like, those things are all on the line and could change overnight.
Right. And
millions of people.
I think that you actually brought up a really important point that people, I don't think, realize. So if you're a conservative listening to this podcast, which I have many, a lot of people talk about defunding Planned Parenthood and defunding, it as an organization. But one thing that I think is left out of this conversation and, really needs to be brought into context is public money is never going to abortions. A lot of people's justification for defunding groups like Planned Parenthood is because of the abortion issue, because they don't want their taxpaying dollars to go towards abortions, when in reality, none of their taxpaying dollars are going to abortion. They're going to things like you said, cancer screenings, to,
for men and women.
For men and women.
Well,
They're going to things that are dealing with women's health. They're going to contraception, to things that have to do with reproductive rights. So these things that's it. I think an important distinction to make, that again, you don't hear that argument being made, and I feel like it's a very clear argument. It's a very simple argument to make, because you can argue as an organization is bad, but when people bring up Planned Parenthood and people say that they don't want their money going to abortions, I think it's important for people who believe in the work that Planned Parenthood's doing, even if you don't agree with specifically the abortion issue, Planned Parenthood's money that they get from the government is not going to abortion. So if that's your qualm about it, then I think that maybe you should find something else to worry about, and maybe you should focus your energy somewhere else, because at the end of the day, it's something that a lot of people believe, but it's built on a lie.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And I think, if we had more women in politics, if we had more women at the table, only 20% of politics is female. If we had more women there, sitting there, more people with uteruses, we would have a lot less of this problem. But if we had more people who had these experiences, who were going to be directly impacted, by these policies, I think we would have a lot broader conversation. I think we may even have some sort of bipartisan conversation, truthfully.
Jamie Fortin, thank you so much for coming on the show. My final question for you is, if you could tell someone who hasn't made up their mind about who they're going to vote for one thing, what would it be?
I think the first thing I would tell them is, I think you should really look at a candidate and think about who do you want representing you? Who do you want standing on a stage and saying, like, this is me and this is what America is, both to, foreign audiences and to domestic ones. For me, I would say abroad, do I want Trump representing me? No, he's alienated a lot of our allies because people don't take him seriously. And domestically, I would say, do I want someone who talks to people like Trump does to represent me? Frankly, I don't. I have one of my best friends, I asked her kind of what she feels about this issue, and she said she's Vietnamese, and she said, honestly, with how Trump talks about minorities, like, my family immigrated here to get away from war and for a better life, and now we're worried that we're going to be targeted. And so I think, that's not the type of person I want representing me. So I would just think about, who do you want representing you, to your family, to your friends, and who would you want to bring to a dinner party with them, and to represent you in every arena of your life, because that's effectively the most impactful thing that the president does for you. And if the answer is Trump, then maybe, rethink who your friends are.
Jamie Fortin, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Cannot wait to have you back on. And thank you guys for listening. This has been Omer 2020. Be sure to look out for our next show covering entertainment and its role in this election. I'm going to have a very special guest to come on and talk about that.